when undercover FBI agent David Mitchell infiltrates a high-powered law firm as a paralegal, he uncovers a chilling pattern of racial profiling and systemic discrimination. As he navigates this treacherous world, he forms an unlikely alliance with junior attorney Rachel Turner, who is slowly awakening to the dark truths of her workplace. Together, they must confront powerful enemies and hidden agendas, racing against time before their secrets are revealed, and lives are shattered in the process. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. David Mitchell adjusted his tie one last time before stepping out of his car. The imposing building of Lawson & Gray stood tall, its glass facade reflecting the early morning light, a symbol of power, prestige, and the very corruption he had been sent to expose. His mind raced through the details of his undercover assignment, the mission that had brought him here, disguised as Ben Taylor, a fresh-faced paralegal, far removed from the seasoned FBI agent he truly was. The target was clear. The firm had a well-kept reputation for success, but underneath that polished surface, there were whispers of manipulation, discrimination, and unethical dealings. It was a different kind of crime than he was used to investigating, quieter, more insidious. He wasn't chasing dangerous criminals this time, but rather the slow rot of a powerful institution that preyed on the marginalized while protecting the powerful. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. David took a deep breath as he entered the lobby, a vision of sleek, cold luxury. Everything gleamed. Marble floors, glass walls, modern art hanging in calculated positions. He observed the people walking briskly around him, their tailored suits and confident strides marking them as part of an elite class. The faint sound of heels clicking and soft conversations filled the air. He could feel the weight of scrutiny, though most glanced at him with mild indifference, already assessing him as insignificant. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s with a sharp, practiced smile, barely looked up as David approached. "Name?" she asked, her eyes never leaving her computer screen. "Ben Taylor," David replied, slipping into his assumed role as effortlessly as he had countless times before. The woman's eyes flicked briefly to his ID before motioning toward a set of doors without a word. As he walked through, David couldn't help but notice the subtle separation between people. The way some lawyers breezed past the paralegals and assistants without acknowledgement, as if they didn't exist. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a hierarchy, a divide between the powerful and the powerless. He had seen it before, in many forms, and it only steeled his resolve. Inside the HR office, David met Karen, the HR director, who walked him through the formalities with brisk efficiency. Karen had a warm smile, but there was something about her posture, her quick movements, that spoke of someone who had grown used to maintaining a pleasant demeanor in a place that demanded it. "You'll be working under Rachel Turner, one of our junior attorneys," Karen explained as they made their way through the labyrinth of hallways. "She's brilliant, but doesn't always play the politics well. That might be why she's still junior." David filed that information away. Rachel Turner, someone who didn't fit the mold perfectly. Maybe that was why he'd been assigned to her team. There was always a reason the FBI chose who they did for their undercover operatives. As they approached Rachel's office, David saw her through the glass. She was hunched over her desk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she typed furiously on her laptop. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and the glasses perched on her nose gave her an air of academic seriousness. She looked up as Karen knocked, her eyes flickering with surprise at the sight of him. "Rachel, this is Ben Taylor, your new paralegal." Karen introduced them with a bright smile that Rachel barely returned. "Nice to meet you," Rachel said, her voice polite but distracted. She gestured toward a small desk in the corner of her office. "That'll be your workspace." David offered a smile, knowing from experience that it would take time to gain her trust. His mission depended on it. He sat down at the desk, glancing at the documents scattered across the surface, files on cases, some ongoing, some pending. His job would be to assist her in any way possible, while quietly collecting evidence of the firm's alleged misconduct. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The first few hours were a blur of orientation and basic tasks, sorting files, making copies, and getting a feel for the way things operated. But David was always observing, always listening. He noticed how the other paralegals and junior staff kept their heads down, rarely engaging with the senior attorneys unless absolutely necessary. There was an unspoken rule here. Know your place. It didn't take long for him to sense the subtle ways in which prejudice operated in the firm. The partners, like Mr. Lawson, were distant figures of authority, rarely seen, but whose presence was felt in every corner of the office. They were the decision-makers, the ones whose word carried weight. And yet, beneath their polished exteriors, David could already sense something darker. His first real taste of it came later that afternoon. As he worked on organizing documents for one of Rachel's cases, he overheard a conversation between two senior attorneys in the hallway just outside her office. Another pro bono case, one of them muttered, clearly annoyed. "Why are we wasting time on these people? They're not paying clients," the other replied with a snort. "Just a publicity stunt, really. Let the juniors handle it." David's blood simmered. The case they were referring to, a young man wrongfully sued for damages, wasn't just a publicity stunt. It was one of many examples of how the firm manipulated the system to protect the powerful while dismissing those who couldn't afford their services. The injustice of it weighed on him, but he kept his face impassive as he continued working, his mind already calculating how to gather more information. Rachel glanced over at him occasionally, her expression softening as the day went on. It seemed she was beginning to notice his work ethic, his quiet efficiency. She handed him more tasks, and though she was still guarded, there was a flicker of something like trust in her eyes. He would need that trust to dig deeper. By the end of the day, David felt the weight of his mission pressing down on him. The subtle, pervasive discrimination within the firm was already becoming clear, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. There was more to uncover, and he would have to tread carefully. As he packed up his things, ready to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment would test him in ways he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about something much more personal, something that cut to the core of who he was and what he believed in. As he left the building, the sun casting long shadows across the street, David knew that this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and the consequences of failure were too great to contemplate. The following morning, David Mitchell, still in his persona as Ben Taylor, arrived at the office early. The air was cool, and the streets were just starting to fill with the usual morning crowd. He liked arriving early. It gave him time to settle into his role, to remind himself of the fine line he was walking. Disguising himself as a lowly paralegal was a stark contrast to his usual work as an FBI agent, where he commanded respect. Here, respect was a privilege only afforded to the select few, and David was expected to remain invisible. As he stepped into the lobby of Lawson and Gray, the sterile, marble-lined corridors felt colder than usual. The firm was beginning to reveal its true colors, not just in its overt actions, but in the quiet, systemic discrimination that permeated its halls. Yesterday had only been a glimpse into the darker side of this prestigious law firm. Today, he knew, would bring him closer to the truth. Rachel Turner was already at her desk when he entered her office, a stack of files in front of her. Her eyes briefly met his, and there was something different in her gaze. Something weary, like she hadn't slept well. "Morning, Ben," she said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "Busy day ahead. I'll need you to help with a deposition this afternoon. You good with transcribing?" "Absolutely," David responded, sliding into his seat. He could sense that Rachel was distracted, her thoughts elsewhere, and he suspected it had something to do with the case she'd been working on. He spent the next few hours assisting Rachel with smaller tasks, typing up documents, reviewing case files, and organizing exhibits. Despite the mundane nature of the work, David's eyes were always scanning for clues, for anything that might lead him closer to the firm's unethical practices. Rachel seemed more at ease with him today. She handed him more sensitive documents, trusted him with tasks that held a little more weight. It was progress. Small, but enough. As David sifted through files, he noticed a pattern emerging in the cases Rachel was handling. Most of them involved clients who had been wrongfully profiled or treated unfairly by larger entities. corporations, banks, or even law enforcement agencies. It was clear that Rachel had a passion for justice, but something about the way the cases were handled didn't sit right with him. The firm, it seemed, took on these cases not out of genuine concern for justice, but as a way to maintain a good public image. David had seen it before. Powerful organizations who painted themselves as champions of the underprivileged while quietly undermining their own clients behind closed doors. And Lawson & Gray was no different. By mid-morning, Rachel was pulled into a meeting with several senior attorneys, leaving David alone in her office. It was the perfect opportunity to dig deeper. He opened her case files, flipping through the pages with practiced precision. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. Legal jargon, witness statements, depositions. But as he delved deeper, he found discrepancies. One file in particular caught his attention. A case involving a young man, Marcus Jennings, who had been wrongfully profiled by a security firm and subsequently sued for damages. The case seemed airtight at first glance, but something about the way the evidence had been collected didn't add up. The security firm had submitted surveillance footage, but there were gaps in the timestamps, gaps that could have easily been overlooked by someone who wasn't trained to spot them. David felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the kind of evidence he was looking for, a breadcrumb that could lead to a much larger trail. He quickly made copies of the relevant documents, careful not to leave any trace of his investigation. He couldn't afford to arouse suspicion. Not yet. As the hours passed, David's mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. The law firm wasn't just neglecting its duties, it was actively participating in manipulating evidence to protect wealthy clients, while people like Marcus Jennings were left to suffer the consequences. It was a carefully constructed system of oppression, one that operated silently and effectively within the walls of one of the country's most respected firms. When Rachel returned from her meeting, she was visibly frustrated. She threw her notebook down on her desk with a sigh, rubbing her temples. "Rough meeting?" David asked, cautiously testing the waters. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that. We're handling a high-profile case right now, and of course, the senior partners want us to prioritize it. Meanwhile, I've got Marcus Jennings' case sitting on the back burner because it's not lucrative enough." She shook her head, her frustration evident. "It's exhausting, Ben. Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle." David leaned forward slightly, careful to maintain his role as the supportive paralegal. "Why do they keep pushing his case aside? It seems important." "Because he's not a priority," Rachel said flatly, her tone laced with disappointment. "Clients like Marcus don't bring in millions in fees. They're just distractions. Pro bono work that looks good on paper but gets treated like an inconvenience." David could see that Rachel was genuinely disillusioned. She wanted to help Marcus, but the firm's focus on high-paying clients made it clear where their true priorities lay. It was a familiar story, one David had seen play out in countless institutions, the devaluation of those who didn't have the wealth or status to command attention. Before David could respond, the door to Rachel's office swung open, and Mr. Lawson himself strode in. The senior partner was an imposing figure, tall and immaculately dressed, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Rachel," Lawson said, his voice dripping with authority, "I need you to focus on the Henderson case. It's a high-stakes deal, and we can't afford any mistakes." Rachel straightened in her chair, masking her frustration. "I'm still working on the Jennings case. It needs attention. There are discrepancies in the evidence that—" Lawson cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Marcus Jennings is not our priority right now. Henderson is." He turned to leave but paused, his eyes landing on David. "And you, Taylor, I expect you to assist Miss Turner in whatever she needs. No distractions?" David met Lawson's gaze, keeping his expression neutral. He nodded, knowing full well that he'd been noticed, but not yet seen as a threat. Lawson didn't linger. He left the room without another word, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Rachel let out a long breath once he was gone. "See what I mean?" she muttered, shaking her head. "They don't care about people like Marcus." David sat back in his chair, considering his next move. He had enough information to confirm that the firm's priorities were skewed, that they routinely manipulated the system to favor the wealthy. But he needed more, something concrete, undeniable. He needed to expose the full extent of their corruption. For now, he would keep his head down, play the role of the quiet, efficient paralegal. But every interaction, every document, every conversation would be another piece of the puzzle. And as Rachel Turner slowly started to realize the depth of the firm's corruption, David knew that she would soon become an invaluable ally, whether she knew it or not. Rachel Turner sat at her desk, staring blankly at the document in front of her. The weight of the firm's expectations, of the unspoken rules that governed her work life, felt heavier than ever. She had always known that law wasn't an easy career, but she had never imagined that her greatest struggle wouldn't be with the law itself, but with the people who manipulated it for their own gain. Her thoughts were a jumble of frustration and disillusionment. The Marcus Jennings case was gnawing at her, a constant reminder of the divide between her principles and the reality of her work at Lawson & Gray. Every time she tried to push for more attention on the case, she was met with resistance, either from her senior colleagues or from the system itself. And now, with the Henderson case taking precedence, she felt like she was drowning in paperwork for clients who had the money to bend the system to their will, while people like Marcus were left behind. She glanced over at Ben, her paralegal, who was quietly reviewing documents across the room. There was something about him, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. He was efficient, attentive, but there was a depth to him that didn't quite match the role he played. He had a sharpness to him that she found surprising in a paralegal. At times, he seemed to notice things that even the seasoned attorneys missed. And more than once, she had caught him looking at her with an expression that was curious. Not the kind of curiosity you saw in a junior staff member trying to impress their superior, but something else, something almost like concern. "Ben," she said, breaking the silence, "what do you make of the Jennings case?" David, still in his undercover role as Ben, looked up, carefully measuring his response. He had to play his part well. Rachel was getting closer to the truth, and if he revealed too much too soon, it could compromise everything. "I think it's worth looking into further," he said cautiously. "There's definitely something off about the evidence. The gaps in the surveillance footage, the timeline, it doesn't add up." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Exactly. But no one else seems to care. Lawson and the others keep pushing it aside, like it's not important. It's frustrating. I came into this field because I wanted to help people, you know? I wanted to make a difference. But every day it feels like I'm just working for the highest bidder." David watched her carefully. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Rachel would start questioning the very foundation of the firm. He needed her to reach this point, but it had to be her decision. He couldn't push her. She had to come to the realization on her own. "I understand," David said quietly. "It's hard when you see the system working against the people who need help the most." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "It's not just hard, it's infuriating. The way this firm operates, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I'm in the right place." David felt a surge of hope. This was it. Rachel was beginning to wake up, to see the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before he could say more, the door to her office opened, and Mr. Lawson stepped in once again, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere in the room. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Rachel, I need you to focus on the Henderson case. We're meeting with the client tomorrow, and I expect everything to be perfect," Lawson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rachel nodded, her face tight with frustration. "I'm on it," she said tersely. As Lawson left the room, David could see the anger simmering just below the surface. Rachel was at a breaking point, and it was only a matter of time before she either snapped or walked away. But David needed her to stay. She was his best chance at getting the evidence he needed to bring the firm's corruption to light. "I'm sorry," David said softly after a moment of silence. "I know it's not easy." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Not easy? That's an understatement. It's like, no matter how hard I try, no matter how many hours I put in, it's never enough. They don't care about the clients. They don't care about justice. All they care about is winning. And I'm tired of it." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He knew that frustration all too well. He had spent years fighting against the very systems that allowed people like Mr. Lawson to thrive, and it never got any easier. But hearing it from Rachel, a woman who had genuinely entered the field to make a difference, made it all the more real. "Do you ever think about leaving?" David asked carefully, testing the waters. Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know. I mean, where would I go? This is one of the top firms in the country. If I walk away from this, I'm throwing away everything I've worked for." David could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between her ambition and her morals, between the life she had built and the values she held dear. It was a struggle he had seen many times before, and he knew it wasn't something she could resolve overnight. "You have to do what's right for you," David said, keeping his tone neutral. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Rachel gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that." The rest of the day passed in relative silence. But the tension between them had shifted. Rachel was starting to trust him more, to see him as someone she could confide in. And that was exactly what David needed. Later that afternoon, they were scheduled to take a deposition for one of the firm's smaller cases. David had expected it to be routine, but as soon as the client walked in, he could sense something was off. The man, Mr. Davis, was visibly nervous, his hands shaking as he sat down at the conference table. Rachel began the deposition, her voice calm and professional. But as Mr. Davis began to speak, it became clear that he was holding something back. "Mr. Davis," Rachel said gently, "you mentioned earlier that there was a change in the documents you submitted to the firm. Can you explain what happened?" Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door as if he was afraid someone might be listening. I don't know if I should say," he muttered. "They told me not to." Rachel exchanged a glance with David, who immediately sensed that this was more than just a routine case. Something was wrong. And Mr. Davis was scared. "Who told you not to say anything?" Rachel pressed, her voice firm but kind. Mr. Davis swallowed hard, his face pale. The partners. They said if I didn't keep quiet, they'd make things difficult for me." Rachel's eyes widened in shock, and David felt a surge of anger. This was it, the kind of corruption he had been looking for. The senior partners were silencing clients, manipulating them into compliance to protect their own interests. "Mr. Davis, you don't have to be afraid," Rachel said softly, her voice filled with genuine concern. "We're here to help you. But we need to know the truth." Mr. Davis looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. "They changed the documents. After I signed them, they altered the dates, made it look like I agreed to terms I never did. I didn't know what to do. They said if I didn't sign, they'd ruin me." Rachel's face paled as the truth sank in. This was worse than she had imagined. The firm wasn't just neglecting its clients. It was actively working against them, falsifying documents and coercing them into silence. David watched Rachel closely, knowing that this moment was pivotal for her. She was seeing for the first time the full extent of the firm's corruption, and he could tell it was shaking her to her core. After Mr. Davis left, Rachel sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. David knew that she needed time to process, but he also knew that this was the beginning of something bigger. Rachel Turner was waking up. She was beginning to see the truth behind the firm's polished facade. And once she saw it, there would be no turning back. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the deposition with Mr. Davis. His shaking hands, his hesitant voice, and the look of fear in his eyes, it all stayed with her long after he had left the conference room. It was as though his words had unlocked something inside her. A realization that had been slowly building ever since she had started working at Lawson & Gray. The firm wasn't just ethically gray. It was corrupt to its core. As she sat in her office that afternoon, staring at the stacks of case files on her desk, Rachel felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had spent years climbing the ranks, working long hours, sacrificing her personal life, all in the belief that she was part of something greater. That by being a lawyer at one of the most prestigious firms in the country, she could make a difference, fight for justice, and help those who needed it most. But the reality was far different. The cases that actually made it to her desk, the pro bono cases she cared about, were few and far between. And even when they did land in her hands, They were treated like afterthoughts, pushed aside in favor of wealthy clients with deep pockets. The Marcus Jennings case had been her breaking point. The discrepancies in the evidence, the way it had been ignored by her senior colleagues, and the way Mr. Lawson had dismissed it without a second thought. It was all too much. And now, with Mr. Davis's confession, the picture was becoming clearer. The firm wasn't just looking the other way when it came to injustice. It was actively participating in it, altering documents, intimidating clients, and manipulating the system for its own gain. Rachel looked over at Ben, who was sitting at his desk, typing up notes from the day's meetings. He had been an invaluable help over the last few weeks. Quiet, efficient, and always there when she needed him. But there was something about him that she still couldn't quite place. He seemed too sharp, too aware for a paralegal. She had caught him more than once observing the senior partners with a look that went beyond mere professionalism. It was as though he was watching them, analyzing them, waiting for something. Her curiosity got the better of her. "Ben," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something?" David, still in his undercover role, looked up from his computer, masking the tension that had been building inside him. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that sooner or later Rachel would begin to question things more deeply. The challenge would be in how much to reveal. "Sure," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "What's on your mind?" Rachel hesitated, as though trying to find the right words. "Do you ever feel like, I don't know, like something's wrong here? I mean, I know it's a big firm and all, and politics are part of the deal, but doesn't it feel like there's more to it?" David paused for a moment, carefully considering his response. He couldn't afford to tip his hand too soon, but he also needed Rachel on his side. "I think every big organization has its issues," he said cautiously. "But yeah, I've noticed some things that don't sit right with me." Rachel nodded, her eyes flickering with frustration. "I don't know what to do anymore. The Davis deposition today, it just confirmed everything I've been feeling. The firm is covering things up. They're manipulating evidence and they're intimidating clients. It's not just about politics or hierarchy. It's about corruption." David felt a surge of hope. Rachel was on the verge of seeing the full scope of the firm's wrongdoing, and he needed her to trust him if they were going to bring it all to light. "I've noticed the same thing," he admitted, his voice low. "The Jennings case, for example. The gaps in the surveillance footage. There's something off about it. I don't think it's an accident." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. "You've noticed that too?" David nodded. "I've been looking into it, quietly. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but now, after what Mr. Davis said, I think there's more going on here than we realize." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just confront Lawson or the other partners. They'll deny everything, and we don't have enough evidence to go public. Not yet." David knew this was his moment to bring her fully on board. He had been working undercover at Lawson & Gray for weeks now, slowly gathering information, but he needed someone on the inside to help him piece it all together. Rachel was smart, capable, and most importantly, she had integrity. She wouldn't stand by and let this corruption continue. "I think we need to gather more evidence," David said carefully. "There's a trail here. We just need to follow it. If we can find the documents they've altered, the clients they've intimidated, we can build a case. But we have to be careful. If they suspect anything, we're done." Rachel's face was a mix of determination and fear. She knew the risks. Taking on the senior partners at Lawson & Gray was no small feat. They had power, influence, and the resources to bury anyone who threatened their empire. But Rachel also knew that she couldn't continue working for a firm that was built on lies and corruption. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'm in. But we have to do this right. We need to be smart about it." David felt a sense of relief wash over him. Rachel was fully on board now, and with her help, he knew they could bring down the corrupt leaders of the firm. But he also knew that the road ahead would be dangerous. Lawson and the other senior partners were not to be underestimated, and if they caught wind of what Rachel and David were up to, they wouldn't hesitate to take drastic measures to protect themselves. Over the next few days, Rachel and David worked quietly but diligently, sifting through case files, deposition transcripts, and internal memos. They found more discrepancies, altered documents, forged signatures, and timelines that didn't make sense. The firm had been systematically falsifying evidence to protect its wealthiest clients, and the deeper they dug, the more damning the evidence became. But with each new discovery, the tension in the office grew. Rachel could feel it in the way Mr. Lawson looked at her during meetings, the way the senior partners seemed to keep a closer eye on her work. She tried to act normal, to keep her head down and play the part of the loyal attorney, but inside, her anxiety was building. She and David were getting closer to the truth, but they were also getting closer to being exposed. One afternoon, as Rachel and David were going over a particularly suspicious set of documents related to the Jennings case, Rachel's office phone rang. She answered it, her heart racing when she heard the voice on the other end. "Rachel, it's Lawson. Can you come to my office for a moment?" Rachel exchanged a glance with David, her stomach twisting in knots. "Of course," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be right there." As she hung up the phone, David gave her a look of concern. "Be careful," he said quietly. "We don't know how much they know." Rachel nodded, swallowing her fear. "I'll be fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The walk to Lawson's office felt like a lifetime. As she entered, she found Lawson sitting behind his massive desk, his expression unreadable. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in a dim, almost foreboding light. "Rachel," Lawson said, gesturing for her to sit. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Rachel sat down, her pulse quickening. She forced herself to remain calm, to act as though nothing was wrong. Lawson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "You've been doing excellent work lately," he said, his voice smooth. "The Henderson case, in particular, has been a great success. I'm considering giving you more responsibility in some of our higher-profile cases." Rachel nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "But," Lawson continued, his tone shifting slightly, "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time on cases that aren't necessarily in the firm's best interest. The Jennings case, for example. I'm concerned that your focus is being pulled in the wrong direction." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was a warning. Lawson was letting her know that he was watching, that he was aware of her interest in the cases the firm wanted to bury. "I understand, sir," Rachel said carefully, "but I believe the Jennings case has merit. There are some discrepancies in the evidence that—" Lawson raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not questioning your dedication, Rachel. I'm simply reminding you where your priorities should lie. We're a team here, and we need to work together for the benefit of the firm." Rachel forced a smile, nodding. "Of course, I'll keep that in mind." As she left Lawson's office, her mind raced. The message was clear. They were getting too close. But Rachel wasn't going to back down now. She had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. When she returned to her office, David was waiting for her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. "They know," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. "Lawson knows we've been looking into the Jennings case. We have to be careful." David nodded, his face grim. "Then we need to move fast. We're running out of time." Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. They were on the verge of exposing something big, something that could bring the entire firm crashing down. But the risks were higher than ever. If they weren't careful, they could lose everything. Rachel could feel the weight of the coming storm. The tension in the air was palpable, like the quiet before a heavy downpour, and she knew that their time was running out. Mr. Lawson's veiled warning in his office had rattled her, but it had also solidified her resolve. He was aware of her and David's investigation into the firm's unethical practices, and that meant they were closer to the truth than ever. But it also meant they were in more danger than she had anticipated. She sat at her desk, staring down at the documents spread out in front of her. They had everything they needed: altered contracts, falsified evidence, proof of client intimidation. It was a mountain of unethical and illegal activity, enough to bring down the senior partners and expose Lawson and Gray for what it truly was: a machine designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. But Rachel knew that just having the evidence wasn't enough. They needed to take the next step and expose it. They needed to be strategic, careful. If they acted too soon, the firm could bury the truth, and both she and David could be ruined. David, still in his role as Ben, the paralegal, entered her office, closing the door behind him quietly. His expression was serious, and she could see the strain of the past few weeks etched in the lines around his eyes. He had been under just as much pressure as she had, maybe more, knowing that his cover could be blown at any moment. "We need to act now," David said, his voice low but urgent. "Lawson knows something's up. If we wait any longer, they'll destroy the evidence. And if they get wind that I'm not who I say I am—" Rachel nodded. She didn't need him to finish the sentence. She knew what would happen if David's true identity as an undercover FBI agent was revealed. He would lose his job, his reputation, and possibly even his freedom if the firm managed to spin the situation in their favor. The stakes were higher than ever. "So what's the plan?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the growing anxiety in her chest. David pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and handed it to her. "I've copied all the evidence we've collected onto this. Everything from the altered documents to the client intimidation. I've also got recordings of conversations between some of the senior partners. It's enough to blow this whole thing wide open." Rachel took the flash drive, feeling the weight of it in her hand. It was such a small, unassuming object, but it held the power to dismantle the corrupt empire that Lawson and his partners had built. But she knew it wasn't that simple. They couldn't just walk into a police station and hand over the evidence. The firm's influence ran deep, and there were people in high places who would protect Lawson and the others if they could. "We need to go public," Rachel said, her voice firm. "We need to take this to the press. If we can get a major outlet to run the story, the firm won't be able to cover it up. Public pressure will force an investigation." David hesitated, and Rachel could see the conflict in his eyes. He was used to working in the shadows, gathering evidence quietly, methodically. Going public wasn't his usual strategy, but he also knew that Rachel was right. The firm was too powerful to take down from the inside alone. They needed the court of public opinion on their side. "All right," David agreed, his voice measured. "But we have to be smart about it. We can't just drop this in any reporter's lap. We need someone who's trustworthy, someone who won't be swayed by the firm's influence." Rachel thought for a moment. She had contacts in the legal world, but few in the media. Then she remembered an old friend from law school, Jessica Brooks, who had left the legal profession to become an investigative journalist. Jessica had a reputation for digging deep and exposing the truth, no matter the cost. If anyone could help them, it was her. "I know someone," Rachel said. "Jessica Brooks, she's an investigative reporter now, and she's one of the best. If we give her this, she'll make sure it gets out there." David nodded, trusting her judgment. "Contact her. But we need to move fast. Once Lawson realizes we're not backing down, he'll tighten his grip on the firm." Rachel grabbed her phone and sent a quick message to Jessica, asking to meet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for a response. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, her phone buzzed with a reply. "Meet me at my office in an hour. I'll make sure this story sees the light of day." Relief flooded through Rachel. It was the first step in what would be a long and difficult process, but it was the right step. She looked at David, who gave her a reassuring nod. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. The meeting with Jessica was tense but productive. Rachel and David laid out everything. Every piece of evidence, every suspicious conversation, every falsified document. Jessica's eyes widened as they walked her through the details. She had expected a big story, but this was bigger than anything she had ever uncovered. The scale of corruption at Lawson & Gray was staggering, and she knew that once the public got wind of it, there would be no stopping the fallout. "This is huge," Jessica said, her voice a mix of shock and excitement. "I'll start working on the article immediately, but we need to be careful. Once Lawson finds out, he'll do everything he can to discredit both of you." "We know," Rachel said, her voice calm but determined. "But we're ready. This needs to come out, no matter what happens to us." David remained silent, but Rachel could see the determination in his eyes as well. They had come too far to back down now. Jessica promised to publish the story within the next 48 hours. It would be a bombshell, a story that would rock the legal world and expose the rot at the core of one of the country's most prestigious law firms. But it was also a ticking time bomb. Once the article went live, there would be no hiding from the consequences. The next 48 hours were a blur of tension and preparation. Rachel and David worked quietly, continuing their day-to-day tasks at the firm as though nothing had changed. But inside, they were both bracing for the storm that was about to hit. When the article finally went live, it was like a shockwave. The headline alone sent ripples through the legal community. Prestigious law firm engages in widespread corruption, client manipulation, and evidence falsification. Jessica Brooks had done her job well. The story was meticulously detailed, laying out every piece of evidence that Rachel and David had gathered and calling for a full investigation into Lawson & Gray's practices. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, media outlets across the country were picking up the story, and social media was ablaze with outrage. The firm's clients, many of them high-profile, began distancing themselves, issuing statements of concern and demanding answers. And behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies were quietly opening investigations into the firm's activities. Rachel watched it all unfold from the safety of her office, her heart pounding in her chest. It was happening. They had done it. The truth was out, and there was no stopping the tidal wave of consequences that was coming for Lawson and his partners. But with victory came risk. Within hours of the story breaking, Rachel received a call from Mr. Lawson himself. His voice was cold, calculated, and filled with barely veiled threats. "You've made a big mistake, Rachel," Lawson said. "You think this is over, but it's not. I've been in this business a long time, and I know how to survive. You and your little paralegal friend are going to regret crossing me." Rachel's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She knew Lawson wasn't bluffing. He had the resources, the connections, and the ruthlessness to destroy them if he wanted to. But she also knew that they had done the right thing. The evidence was out, the public was watching, and the wheels of justice were already in motion. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles, media scrutiny, and public outrage. Lawson & Gray was quickly falling apart. Several senior partners were forced to resign, and a full investigation was launched into the firm's practices. Mr. Lawson, once untouchable, was now facing legal action, his reputation in tatters. Rachel and David, though, were not immune to the fallout. Rachel resigned from the firm before they could fire her, knowing that her career there was over. But she left with her head held high, knowing that she had done what was right. As for David, his undercover work was revealed to the firm, and though he had completed his mission, the fallout was personal as well. He had grown attached to Rachel, and while they had brought down a corrupt empire together, the bond they had formed was tested by the intensity of the ordeal. In the end, the firm was dismantled, and the people who had perpetuated the corruption faced the consequences. Justice was served, but it came at a cost. Rachel's career in the corporate world was over, but she found peace in knowing that she had stayed true to her values. She began working in nonprofit law, dedicating her skills to helping those who truly needed it. As for David, he returned to the FBI, but the experience had changed him. He had seen firsthand the damage caused by unchecked power and corruption, and it deepened his commitment to fighting for justice. He often thought of Rachel, the courageous woman who had stood by him, risking everything to expose the truth. They had both emerged from the storm, changed but stronger. Months later, as David sat in his office reviewing new cases, he received an unexpected message from Rachel. She wanted to meet. Excitement and apprehension filled him as he agreed to see her at a local cafe. When they met, the air was thick with unsaid words. Rachel looked different, more grounded and confident. They exchanged stories about their new paths, her work in nonprofit law, and his ongoing investigations. The shared understanding of their past challenges created an immediate bond, and they both felt the lingering chemistry that had ignited during their time together. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Rachel began, her gaze steady. "And I realized that I don't want to lose what we had. We fought against something so big, and we came out on the other side. I want to keep fighting, but I want to do it with you." David's heart raced at her words. He had missed her, not just as a partner in the fight against injustice, but as someone who understood him in ways few could. I feel the same way. We make a good team, Rachel. I want to continue this fight together, but in a different way. Maybe even help each other navigate what's next. As they talked, plans began to take shape, not just for their careers, but for their future. They discussed the idea of collaborating on cases that involved marginalized communities, using their experiences to empower those who had been victimized by systemic discrimination. Over time, they developed a small nonprofit organization dedicated to legal advocacy, focusing on civil rights and providing legal assistance to those who couldn't afford it. Their shared mission not only rekindled their bond, but also reignited their passion for justice. One afternoon, while preparing for a community outreach event, Rachel paused and looked at David. "You know, we didn't just expose Lawson and Gray. We sparked a movement. People are starting to demand accountability. What we did was just the beginning." David smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "We couldn't have done it without each other. And now, we have the chance to keep that momentum going. We can make real change." Their organization grew, attracting volunteers and support from various sectors. As they navigated the challenges of building their nonprofit, they also deepened their relationship, finding comfort and strength in one another. Each case they took on was a testament to their commitment to justice, and every success reminded them of the power of courage and integrity. In the end, Rachel and David understood that the fight for justice was ongoing. They had come a long way from their initial encounter at the law firm, but the world still needed voices like theirs, unwavering and dedicated to uncovering the truth, standing against corruption, and uplifting those who were often silenced. Their journey together was a testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times, courage could shine through, and karma would ensure that those who acted with malice would ultimately face the consequences of their actions. Together, Rachel and David committed to making a difference, one case, one life at a time, knowing that they were stronger together than apart. And so, beneath the surface of a world that often seemed indifferent, they built a legacy of hope, courage, and unwavering resolve, determined to continue the fight for justice in every corner of their community. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.